Hello, friends. Welcome back to the School of Self Worth. I'm your host, Nicole Song. This week, we have got someone super special for you. I had an incredible conversation with Elaine Lin Hering, who's the author of Unlearning Silence: How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully. Elaine has such extensive experience with organizations and individuals, building skills in communication, collaboration, and conflict management. And we had a really deep and expansive conversation about silence in the workplace. So, places that we silence ourselves, places that we are silenced, and especially as it pertains to women of color in the workplace. So, this is a really rich, powerful conversation. Make sure to stay tuned to listen to it. And if you are an ambitious Asian American woman who wants to manifest a promotion in 60 days while working 20% fewer hours, DM me promotion on Instagram at Nicole Song. I've got something special for you. Okay, let's dive into this remarkable conversation today with Elaine. Elaine, thank you so much for being on the School of Self Worth. I'm so thrilled to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, I have been following you for some time and I've heard you speak in other places. And so it's just, I love hearing you talk about topics that I think feel really challenging, oftentimes to women in general, definitely to Asian American women. And so, I always like to dig in with your own story and your own journey. So I'm curious if you could share with us sort of the beginning of the recognition, perhaps, that you had a journey of self worth to embark upon and like what that started out as and how that looks to this day.
Mm,
Mhm.
how much do you want to know?
I mean, well, I want to know lots of things.
And I start there, and there's this deep pause in a how did we get here? So my own journey is I spent a lot of time, as I think many women do, focusing on everyone else's needs.
Hmm.
And I don't think I just made that up. I don't think women made that up. I think that is acculturation. That is sometimes indoctrination. That is being a good woman. It turns into the narrative of being a good human. You're thinking about everybody else, making sure everyone else is taken care of. And in that, what gets lost? Oftentimes ourself. And so our self worth also gets tied up in productivity and gets tied up in serving other people. It gets tied up in other people's opinions of us. And it's reinforced by the way workplaces are structured, by often how family cultures are structured and perpetuated. I'm a mother of a 6-year-old navigating summer where we got to wrap up this podcast soon so I can go pick up the kid. And where is the self worth there when it feels like you're not performing on all cylinders in every part of your life? So I'm not sure my story is all that different than most people's. I had a very traditional, ticked all the boxes education, University of California, Berkeley, undergrad, go Bears, is what I'm supposed to say. And then Harvard Law School, and got off the path of big law into an area called leadership development that I didn't know existed. And that was my grand rebellion. My mother was really worried when I went to law school and didn't practice law, and high achieving, high performing. And so a lot
Mhm.
of worth and self worth was tied up into what clients am I working with? What professional achievements have I made partner yet? I was the first non-white partner at a global leadership development firm. And in all of that, though, there's a question of where is the worth coming from? And is that validity or worth coming from my ability to channel other people's thoughts and execute well on their visions? Or is there something inherently worthwhile, worthy about who I am? Which is where I've come to of if I believe that every single human being actually is worthy and has self worth by nature of being human, and I am also human, then maybe that also applies to me.
I love that. I'm curious because, like there is a lot in that journey. Where do you remember having a distinct moment where you observed like that tie-in of self-worth and productivity? Was it a
Mm,
realization over time, or were there moments where you actually had to pause and be like, what the heck is going on here? Like, what am I really doing? Like, what is driving what's happening in my life?
yeah, the productivity is an ongoing, I'll call it a battle because it is.
Mm,
And my closest friends will tell you that of I didn't grow up knowing how to hang out or rest. Like I knew how to work hard and meet the deadlines and outperform. And so I remember one very distinct moment sitting on the floor in my apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts with friends. I think they were looking things up on YouTube. We were in our 20s. And I was like, so what are we going to do? Are we going to go climb a mountain? Are we going to go volunteer at a soup kitchen? And they're like, we're hanging out. And I was like, oh, this is what hanging out is. And they still mock me about it to this day with love. And so, this question of if you aren't producing, if you aren't doing, is that okay?
mhm,
And really coming to learn not only is it okay, but it is necessary for rest, for refueling.
mhm.
And it is an ongoing journey, especially how do you find that time or make that time when it feels like there's so many other people and things pulling, not just for time, but energy.
It's such a deeply entangled place, right? That productivity tie in. Because I find that for a lot of women, for myself and other women I work with, that first we get better at not working all the time. And that's the
Hmm.
first step, right? Like, okay, I'm not going to work nights. I'm not going to work weekends. I'm going to actually leave my computer at home on vacation. And
Totally.
that is like a really big, that's like a really, I will not diminish it. That is a
We are
very
going to
big,
celebrate that
that is like a really big step.
milestone.
So I do not, yeah, I don't want to downplay that because that is a really big step for a lot of my clients.
Yeah.
But then after that, there's also the level of like productivity in the like spare time, which is
Hmm.
hard. And I'm like a big hiker. Like I love to
Mm.
move my body and challenge myself. And so sometimes it's like, it turns into, okay, like here's all the things to tick all the boxes, as you said, but of the weekend boxes, right?
Yeah.
And then I have found for myself the place that helps me the most is reading. And I
Mm.
had to learn to not read for growth. Like I don't
Yeah.
read nonfiction and self development in my spare time. I do listen to those books, but I
Yeah.
read fiction. And then I actually relax. Although I do laugh, my friend and I have like a challenge for how many books we're reading, but like we do, because we always like this make it fun, it makes it fun for us.
Yes.
But I do find for myself sometimes it's like, well, my only plan today is to read for 2 hours,
Mm.
and it can be really hard to just be like, that's all I'm gonna do. Because in my
Hmm.
household, at least, like my husband takes care of a lot of the other stuff. Like he
Mm.
cleans and he does other things, and so that gives me space to do that. But
Hmm.
then it can be hard. You're like, I guess that's all I'm doing. I'm just gonna sit on the couch and read.
And I look at other people in my life, like my husband, who seems to have no problem with taking that time
Yeah.
and space. And I, it really makes me pull back the layers of how did we get here? What assumptions do I hold about how one becomes deserving of that space?
Mhm.
If there is that space, how do I take it and not feel guilty about it? Not be using it to make a mental list of the things I would do, to not feel the pressure to relax faster.
Mhm.
And all of that to me has been experiments over time of what if I took a nap during the middle of the day? And I say that in that hushed tone.
Yeah.
Not only is that allowed, but it might actually be good for me, and really listening each of ourselves to our own bodies to say, what do I need at this time? What would be good for me? And letting that be part of the equation. And I've had to use the mental hack that I've written about, which is if I don't think I'm worth considering just by nature of being me, I've had to intellectualize it to say, Negotiation theory tells me that any party to a negotiation has a set of needs, goals, hopes, and concerns. I am a stakeholder in this negotiation, and there, ipso facto, I also have a set of needs, goals, hopes, and concerns. And you know what? I'm choosing not to judge myself for having to do the mental hack to get there because it still gets me to a healthier place
Mm,
that over time also is a reminder that there is a different way to live than the constant hamster wheel of feeling like I need to prove myself or earn the right to exist.
mhm. Yeah, there's so many layers in all of this because I think I always am looking at that fine line of how can you give yourself permission to be totally ambitious and to desire big things? Like you wrote a book, like you're a mom, like there's so many things you want to do in your life. And I am the same way. And that overachieving in high intensity, like must prove myself at all
Mm,
costs. And I'm kind of curious, like, how do you walk that line for yourself or that definition for yourself of like, what do I get to do because I just want to? Because like I have
mm,
impact I want to make on the world and things I'm here to do. And I coach a lot on purpose. Like, who am I here to be? And like a lot of what I
mm,
do, like this podcast and writing books, is very much I'm here to share that. I'm here to own my voice, which is very much what your book addresses too around silence. Like,
mhm.
if I am silent, then that is actually not going to do anything for the world. I'll just be yet another woman, yet another Asian woman who doesn't speak up. And so it's
Mm,
important. But then how do I also not let it go to that other side of just like that hamster wheel and constant and proving and all of that
yeah.
piece.
Yeah, the big shift for me was thinking a lot about silence, which I know we'll get into, but also that the difference between silence that is additive or strategic and silence that is oppressive is agency. Do I get to choose when, where, and how I want to use my voice? And voice not just being the words that we use in a meeting, but how we move through the world. Because at the same time, to put pressure on ourselves or absorb the pressure from others to be fill in the blank, to do this is also not centering our own agency or our unique purpose in the world. And so it's been a lot of experimentation and ongoing listening of what do I want to do? If I have one life to live, how do I want to live it? The choices I make today add up to be my life. And maybe from the outside, I look more ambitious than I actually am because it wasn't I have a goal to write a book, so I'm going to write a book. It really was looking at the leadership material around us and saying, and having taught skills for negotiation, difficult conversations, and feedback tools and frameworks out of the Harvard Negotiation Project from my colleagues for decades, and thinking, a lot of it seems useful. And there seems to be this big missing piece around silence. And when we talk about using our voice or extending agency, the advice so often boils down to just do it. And as much as I love a good Nike slogan, just do it also means that the message comes through as women. You need more courage. You need more confidence. Go fix yourself, and then you might get promoted. Then you might get a seat at the table. Then you might deserve to get a break, but probably not because systemically we'll keep overworking you. And that analysis felt incomplete and irresponsible. So then for me, the impetus for writing the book really was this analysis of women go fix yourselves, or anyone with a subordinated identity, go fix yourself, doesn't take into account the other factors that silence us. And I think we're answering the wrong question. Instead of how do I speak up, I think the question is what role does silence play in our lives and on our teams and in our organizations? Because if we can ask a more accurate question, we have a better chance at moving the needle and creating spaces where we can actually thrive. So then it was a question of, is the system actually going to see it? is the system publishing um, going to get it? And are they going to be willing to take a bet on someone who does not look like the majority of people who write business, leadership, personal growth books, smaller platform, not cis white male, first time author? And it really was an experiment to say, I have very little to lose. Let me and my agent go out and see if anyone's interested. And publishers were interested. And then this book came forth. And then it was the pressure to, oh, shoot, I sold a book. I have to write it. Never done that before. How do you figure it out? So I shared that I think when we look at other people, we're looking at their outsides when we experience our own insides. And that no matter how much someone might seem like they have it together or be living in a really, their life fits and makes sense, um, it doesn't feel that way. But taking one step and then another step, each step reveals something, and learning from the information that you get gets you to a next place to then make a next decision and a next step. And that integrating the real time information that we get and checking in with our purpose most of the time leads us down a path of actually living in a way we might be proud of. And that in retrospect, the path makes a lot more sense, even if it's nonlinear and has a lot more zigs and zags than we might hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing all those pieces. One of the things that came up as you were speaking, and I thought this many times during the book too, is there's this fine line between the responsibility of the place, the culture, and the responsibility of the individual. And I'm kind of curious
Mhm.
for you, like, who did you think you were writing towards in the book?
This is the $1,000,000 question that we went cycles over, including can it be both? And I'm
Mm.
almost more curious to know what you think and what landed. So maybe we'll integrate that as part of the equation and conversation. I had two audiences for the book. One of my primary goals with the book was for people who have long been silenced to feel seen, known, and heard. For women in particular and women of color to say, oh, it wasn't me. Everyone
Mhm.
told me I had imposter syndrome. Everyone told me I needed to go to assertiveness training. Yeah, I've learned silence over time, but it's this thing called silence. It's not me. I'm not deeply, fundamentally flawed, no matter what my grandfather once told me over dinner.
Mhm.
That was one reader. The other reader was and is well intentioned leaders, which sometimes we are both. Oftentimes, we are both the people who have been silenced and the well intentioned leader, meaning, regardless of our good intentions, we so often end up inclining the people around us towards silence. And particularly if we are leading in the ways that we have observed or experienced, rather than thinking about what do I want to do and how do I want to lead and what imprint do I want to leave on the people around me, um, needing to invite each of us in to acknowledge the power we have and to challenge us to create those spaces where voice, not just our own, but voices are welcome and invited and supported. So, this is my question to you as to whether I've achieved that.
Well, it was interesting because, I'm on the personal development side. So I always, and the work I do with my women is very specific around where are you silencing yourself? Where
Hmm.
are you not speaking up, being visible in the ways? And I am not an advocate of doing it in the ways that, I think a patriarchal white culture expects.
Yep.
And at the same time, where are you also holding yourself back? And that is a fine line for them, right? Like, where is it where you're holding yourself back because that's what you were taught, or
Hmm.
you learned it, or you saw your parents do it? And then there's this level of like, where are you forcing it
Hmm.
just because? And
Hmm.
so I come very much from that side. And I also know, like, I feel like what happened with the book for me is it kind of expanded my understanding of saying, okay, like, where in the system can you start to create change? Because the other thing about from the personal development side is that we can't actually change the system individually, right? Like, I mean, you can change it as an individual to start to create change. I own
Mhm.
my own business. Like, I get to create the culture of my business. So I
Yeah.
purposefully hire women of color. Like, there's a lot that we do within my business to make sure that's okay. And we're teeny tiny, right? Compared to like a big corporation.
Mhm.
And so it was an interesting thing for me because sometimes I think it can be challenging as a woman. You're like, well, if that's just the system, I'm just so screwed.
Mhm.
Versus how do we really feel empowered to then be able
Mhm.
to acknowledge our own complicity in
Yeah.
how the system is existing, and then
Yeah.
also, when do you stop fighting it? Because a lot of times with my women, what we work on is just getting to a place where your nervous system is not constantly fried and you're not anxious and pissed off all
Yeah.
the time at your bosses or whatever. And then you
So
might actually,
baseline.
yeah, totally. Like, you just need a good, stronger baseline to make a clear decision. And
Yeah.
perhaps you're actually not aligned with where you work. And if that's
Yeah.
the case, then we make a new choice and go somewhere else. But you fighting it isn't going to do anything for you except make you
Mm.
more stressed, anxious, and worked up. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of what came up for me when I was thinking,
Yeah.
when I was listening to your book and like thinking about the concepts that you were presenting there.
Yeah. And a big piece of it was, look, we can own everything that you just talked about, and it may still not be enough
Mhm.
because those systemic changes or the changes of our direct manager and leader, that's their work to do. And so, my work over time, my hope with the next 3 to 5 years is that Unlearning Silence gets embedded in leadership development programs and corporate spaces around the world so that the leaders who otherwise wouldn't have picked up the book start owning the content in chapters 5 and 9, which is how we silence others and how to stop silencing people, because there's only
Mm.
so much we as women can do. And that's not to say that we don't have power, but to draw a healthy boundary around the work that is ours to do and what others might need to own and be accountable for.
Yeah, that's interesting because I do think of it. I think for my whole thing that I work on is like, how do we not give up our own power? And that is
Hmm.
a big journey, right? That is a really big journey for women.
Yeah.
And like you said, there obviously are always systemic things that need to be changed.
Hmm.
And I think for me, I always grapple with like, well, where can we really? Because I always know change starts with myself. But if you are the
Hmm.
leader reading the book, then you could actually be that person who makes that change. And as not that person, like, I'm not that part of the audience per se, except perhaps within my own business.
Yeah.
It was just, yeah, it was just an interesting thing because I could feel it kind of, you were moving between the two things in there, and I was like, interesting.
And
But
trying really hard to do all the dance because, I
yeah.
mean, if I'm honest, right, I'm dancing around white fragility in writing this book.
Mm,
I'm dancing around male egos
mhm,
and trying to. Someone said to me, Elaine, I was surprised that it wasn't an angry book. And I was like, yeah, I'm glad it didn't read to you as an angry book. It really genuinely is meant as an invitation with the greatest compassion. If you are a leader, whatever background, with the intention to support the people around you, in what ways might I and this question around silence be able to bring you more in alignment with who you intend to be, with your own purpose, knowing that it's going to take each of us.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like there was so much in there. Like, it's just a really big, rich topic
Hmm.
because it's always that question of like, are you being silenced? But then how are you silencing yourself? And then
Hmm.
also, what I had to learn eventually is that silence is really can be very powerful. And
Hmm.
that a lot of times I think what people pick up is like, I have to be the loudest, most assertive one. I'm like, well, power comes from the people who are quiet too, and
Hmm.
the ones who are listening. And you
Hmm.
often find very powerful people don't say a whole lot,
Hmm.
and really understanding that, because once you are in your own power, then you are more capable of being that person. But it's a journey to get to that point.
Completely. And the more that we can shift perception around what leadership looks like or competence looks like, that I want to ask the quieter person in the room, hey, what's running through your mind? Because you
Mm,
always have such great insights. Or what are the rest of us missing as we're yammering around? Right? The total both and.
right. Well, and I think of it too, not being in those rooms per se, but like, how do you structure that conversation to make sure that everyone gets a say? Like, I
Yeah.
ran a nonprofit board for a while, and you have to do that. Like, otherwise, just the loud people are the ones who are always talking.
Yeah.
Right. And I was always definitely like, I'm very direct now in my life, but I
Mm,
didn't used to be. And I didn't
yeah.
always used to be the person who spoke up. And I would say I'm not always necessarily, but if there's a situation where the only way to get what I want is to speak up, like I absolutely will. And I
Mhm.
think that's something I had to learn and figure out. But it
Yeah.
can be difficult because it depends on the environment. If I'm on a Zoom call of 200 and the only way to get attention is to like raise my hand, like I will,
Mhm.
but not everyone will do that.
Yeah.
And so,
And to me, it comes down to intentionality and design,
right.
right? We spend so much time in our products talking about user experience, and yet, why is there a 1 p.m. meeting on Thursday in a time zone that doesn't really work? I don't know. It was set up by 3 project managers ago, right? Are we just defaulting to what has been done
Mm,
on autopilot, or are we designing the way that we communicate? Because when we default to the patterns and preferences of the people with the most hierarchical power or longevity within a team or organization, without considering in what ways does that pattern of communication create an undue barrier to entry in the conversation, not actually getting us to the outcome that we want, presumably, which is solid information from different perspectives that allow good decision making.
hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One other, just switching gears slightly, but one thing that really stood out to me in the book is when you also talked about the difference between, well, actually, you talked about cultural fits.
Mm,
And then it really raised for me, so it's like telling the part of who you are. And then the question I had around this was more about like, what's the difference between editing yourself and culture editing you? And like, how do you start
mm.
to navigate that? And I'm curious for you. I'm like just checking to see if I explain this succinctly enough for our readers, but maybe you should, or listeners, that maybe you should explain to them
Well, and
the
and when
cultural
you say
fit
cultural
piece.
fit, which part are you thinking of?
I think it was just the part where you're like saying about like what the cultural fit, where it's like the part of you who's edited out, like that form
Hmm.
of silence. So when we decide that that's not a cultural fit, so we could even go into like cultural background, right? So I'm
Mm,
Chinese American, so I might have edited out the part of me that's
mm,
like, this is just like a silly one, but when you go to dinner, everyone always, like, one person always like grabs the bill and pays for
yeah.
it, and that's how it is. But you edit that out in America because that's not really how it
Mm.
goes, and then you would literally just probably end up buying dinner for everybody all the time instead of having like
We should go
the
to dinner
the
together.
back and forth, right? But like I think about that, but that's like a cultural
Hmm.
thing which I edited out because
Mm,
culturally that's not really how it goes unless I'm with family. Like then we definitely
hmm.
still do it that way.
Hmm.
So I think of it that way. So I'm not sure like how that applies directly into the book, but it made me think about like what's the part that I've edited out,
Hmm.
what's the part that culture has edited out of me, and that I've just done to assimilate.
And they're so often synonymous,
Mm,
right? It is really hard to parse what is a cultural message that I've internalized or that I have decided to edit out, or I'm choosing not to share this part of myself. I'm choosing not to implement this practice that may or may not have come from a culture. And so much of that happens in a way that is not intentional, that we are not aware that it is even happening. It's just over time. Oh, I wonder why I haven't shared this identity of mine.
mm,
Sometimes in the workplace in particular, it is active concealment, right? Let me not
right.
highlight the fact that I am a mother because I know or have been told by other leaders that being a parent, specifically a mother, means that I am seen, therefore, as unreliable or not able to take on big challenges. So there is that conscious editing and censoring, including then very often some conscious revealing, which I do much more these days because I feel like, I have enough credentials. People tend to still hire me, even, there's enough proof that motherhood hasn't compromised my effectiveness as a professional and want to normalize it, right? In the way that someone more junior or newer to an organization might not have that. I see that as a privilege. And how do I use that to change the narrative over time? The key for me is, are you aware that you're even doing it? And the awareness and the intentionality goes back to agency. Am I choosing to not disclose here because fill in the blank reason? Or do I not even realize that I've never mentioned it? A story I often tell when I'm speaking is that I was part of a entirely white team for a long time. And it wasn't until 10 years into my tenure within the organization, we were on Zoom, and an Asian American admin who had joined our team was eating a bowl of ramen for lunch with chopsticks, that I realized that in my 10 years, I have never seen anyone use chopsticks. And that when I'm on camera, I don't use chopsticks, even though I use them every night.
Mm.
That was such a moment of, in what ways do we edit out parts of ourselves without realizing? Not because anyone told us we had to, but because mimicry is such a powerful force. Made more explicitly, some of the books on influence will tell you if you want people to like you, say yes to you, want to work with you, you should look and sound like them.
Mm.
Don't use chopsticks. And particularly when you are the only, the first, the few, or the only, you already stick out so much anyways, and your seat at the table feels so tenuous. The Australians would call it tall poppy syndrome. Why would you stick out differently? So, are you aware that you're doing that editing out? Is it intentional? For what purpose? Are you okay with that? Are you not okay with it? Is it a rule or an assumption that is implicit or explicit? Is it negotiable? Would you want to clarify it? Is that the battle that you want to fight? I think there are a lot of different leverage points along the way, but it all starts with noticing.
Yeah, it feels like when you say it that way, I'm like, oh, there's just so many complex decisions to be made along the way to really be yourself in those environments. Like, how do you keep doing it? And is it that simple? It's like, I'm just going to eat my ramen with my chopsticks today. And then that's it. Like, it's just going to be really simple that way.
Also,
Or,
like,
yeah,
ramen is now in.
right. It's so, I know
So
it's very cool now. Like, all the Asian foods are like so popular now, right? Which they weren't 10, 20
they
years
weren't.
ago. Yeah.
They weren't.
They really weren't. Yeah, it used
Yeah.
to be if I wanted to eat dumplings, people were like, "What?" And now everyone's like, "Oh yeah, dumplings, let's go!" Right?
Not even dumplings, but like xiaolongbao.
Yeah, totally. People
Yeah.
know specifically. Like we have, I'm in Seattle. We have Ding Tai Fung. Everybody
Yes.
knows.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, they're like, "I want soup dumplings." I'm like, "Yeah, let's go get some
yeah,
xiaolongbao." Great. Yeah,
yeah.
but it didn't used to be that way, right? It's like, and then I also think about too, because it used to be for me like a lot of the suppression was cultural around foods. But then
Mm,
there's other cultural pieces. Like I think a lot about how Asian communities in particular, like the collective and the group, is more important than the individual, and like it's such a battle. I think for
yeah.
all immigrant children, immigrants themselves, to be in this super individualistic culture when you were
Mhm,
not raised that way, and then you're
mhm,
expected to be like so dominant and bold,
mhm.
and they're like, that's just not how you're raised on any level, right?
And that to me is exactly the both and we were talking about earlier of how do I own the what I have learned, what has made my culture, my background, my family, my ancestors, my lineage strong. And if that feels aligned with who I am, because there's a nature nurture question, then how do I lean into that and embrace that and lead in my way? Right? That's the opportunity of what is my way going forward rather than where I've come from or what's around me. And how does the world around me recognize those potentially quiet or different behaviors also as high potential or leadership?
Mm-hmm.
That's the work that the environment around me, the existing leaders with influence and power need to do. And my work is to figure out how do I want to show up.
Yeah, it's so true. Well, I would love to switch gears briefly now to your book journey and the self-worth journey you had to go on to like write it and then to market it, and what was that like for you?
Long and difficult.
Yeah, it is.
How's that for a short, pithy? I mean, the book is titled Unlearning Silence: How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully, is the US version, and the UK version ends with Lead with Courage. And very honestly, it is the experience was the book on a meta level.
Mm,
And so everyone says writing a book turns you inside out. This felt next level from, will anyone buy it? Any publisher buy it? To the publishers bet big on me. I better deliver so that I prove that women or women of color can actually deliver on book deals and publishers continue to bet on us. To, do I have anything to say? To, is anyone other than my mother going to read this? To, oh gosh, what is my mother going to think? To doing it and people responding in such beautiful, authentic ways to, wow, like you put a name, you put language to the thing I was experiencing. I mean, writing this book really was me finding my own voice, finding that there is worth in my own thoughts. And I still feel very much midstream in that journey. The parts of my journey that are not visible is that part and parcel to writing and launching the book was separation from the place that I thought was going to be my professional home,
Mm.
as a way of exercising my own agency, living into my values, getting to preserve my voice. So when I say that using your voice can be costly and messy, that comes from deep personal experience.
Mhm.
And that it is so very worth it to get to actually be yourself rather than feel like you need to be an imitation of someone else.
Well, what a worthwhile journey. I mean, really, I always think that. I remember the first time I was a journalist before, and then I started taking yoga teacher training, and then I
Mm,
remember my first teacher training, I realized that the job was not to really teach yoga poses, although that you do that, but is actually to be the most authentic version of yourself because that's
mhm,
how people relate and connect to the teacher. And I was
mhm.
like, that's a job? Like just to be authentic? Like that's all you have to do? And I was like, well, actually this is really hard. But but it is an interesting and amazing journey. And I was like really lucky that that was like my second career. And now as an
Mm,
entrepreneur that I have been stepping into roles that have required me to be my most authentic self for like 15 years now. But it is
yeah.
an interesting thing because when, most of your life you're not told to be authentic, you're told to like play the game, do things a certain way. That's how like journalism is very much like do things a
Mhm.
certain way and that's how you rise up the ladder. And so, I love like that you're saying that you're like, and it is extremely messy. Like my own story is also very messy because being authentic means often going against the grain of what expectations are or what other people think you should be doing.
Yeah. And not being, there's so many calls to, be your authentic self,
Mhm.
lead authentically, and do the actions and reactions and behaviors of the people around you, or saying that actually support and create the conditions where it makes sense for you to do that.
Right.
Otherwise, why would you? Which is what takes me back to agency, and I know our common value of living purposefully and intentionally, because it is really costly at times to be authentic.
Yeah. Yeah, because people, when you are authentic, people can't always accept it or be okay
Mhm.
with it. It can be, there's a good reason I run my own business. I would say, like, you couldn't hire me anymore because, for me, it's like very much about expression and being able to be in action about expression is very
Mhm.
particular. And it's hard when you're in an environment that's not necessarily okay with those actions. And I'm
Mhm.
not saying to everyone you have to be an entrepreneur for this, but it's still an interesting thing. It's like a dilemma, I think, for a lot of people like
Mhm.
what does authenticity look like, how do I do that, and how is that going to change my life? And now this sounds scary and I don't know if I want to do any of it. Right.
Yeah. I mean, all of that is the deep work that doesn't fit nicely into 30-minute increments.
Yeah.
You can't stir it up and then put it back in the box or the can for your next meeting.
Yeah.
And so, if you're convinced or intrigued by living that way, how do you embark on that journey? Often with someone like you, Nicole, holding space for and creating that journey to be able to do it in a thoughtful, not overwhelming, but probably still messy way, because humans are messy
Yeah.
and our humanity is messy.
Yeah, and it is messy, but I think oftentimes, like, we're afraid, and I was definitely raised to be like, you don't want the mess, right? Like the messy is like to be avoided.
Mhm.
And I'm someone who's also been through a divorce as well as on my third career, like I've done a
Mm,
lot of things, I think very unorthodox and messy. And then once you start doing it messy, it doesn't make it easier each time, but you at least understand that messy is going to be part of it and that's okay.
yeah.
Whereas if you've never had it messy, it can feel it's like very like, oh, some of you listening are probably like want it to be a little bit messier, but that's also very terrifying. And so then we have to learn how to navigate that, like what is the
Yeah.
truth? And then also to me, this is always the big part. What's the cost of it, of you not doing it? And when that
Yes.
cost gets really high, like that's when people start to
Yes.
fall apart. Yeah.
Yes. And that the cost is always there.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if you're not falling apart, right? That cost is there in the background constantly, just talking to you. Yeah. It's so true.
Or not talking, it's talking to you and you're not listening, so it's internalized in your body and then it shows up in hair loss and insomnia and rashes.
That
Not
too.
that
Well,
I'm pointing to any specific
for
experience at
yourself.
all.
Oh yeah, like hospitalizations. I have heard like every story you can think of for physical ailments. Well, yeah, but
Well, and so let's parse that out
yeah.
because this was a big piece of people are like, why do you want to talk about silence? Silencing ourselves, our own needs, desires, wants, having to silence ourselves, walking around on eggshells or feeling like that is the only way to stay in relationship or at work, keeps our nervous systems on chronic high alert,
Mm,
which they were not meant to do. And so it is a can of worms, but it is ultimately to get to a healthier place and also to mitigate that social isolation that comes from thinking it's just me, because it is not just you. There are very few things that are new under the sun that someone else has not dealt with, thought about, navigated. And that the more that we talk about it and are able to share, hopefully someone knows, oh, hey, me too, right? And that there is a way forward, usually together rather than alone.
yeah. I think it is really important to talk about the physical cost too, like you
Mm,
said, because it is the first place it manifests for most people when they're not paying attention to it. And then understanding it is so common. Like women come into my groups and they're like, oh, we're all dealing with the same things. I'm like, all of
yes.
you are dealing with the
Yes.
exact same things. You just
Yes.
didn't know because you didn't talk about it to anybody
Totally.
else. But then you come
Totally.
in here and you're like, oh, but there's something really beautiful in that. Then you
Mhm,
just feel more relaxed. You're like, okay, I can handle this and I can figure
mhm,
this out versus being
mhm.
in that stress state.
Totally. And in the book, I talk about that as uh, double pain. I mean, this is one of
Mm,
the interesting things about writing a book, not knowing what my own voice was. It was apparently my voice is deeply researched because it needs to be, because I'm an Asian American woman in America and in corporate spaces. Apparently I reference the Golden State Warriors, Top Chef, Queer Eye, and Mario Kart. And that is part of my voice. But the
mhm.
Mario Kart reference is to a double pain of there's that initial pain of job loss or cancer diagnosis, whatever it is, nasty feedback from work. And then there's the double pain that is magnified of thinking it's just me or I can't talk about it with anyone.
Mm,
And so it is incredibly healing to come together and realize, oh, it's not just me. And that in navigating it together, we can at least solve for the double pain, even if there are no quick fixes to that initial pain.
yeah. That's so beautifully said. I mean, I really feel, and I always hope that people get that from the podcast too. And that's why I like having people share the stories because I think it's important for us to remember, like, even highly successful people like you who have a book that's out that's doing really well, that people can be like, oh, there's so much to that story that I relate to. And then I just
Mhm.
need to be on my own journey of what that looks like.
Well, and I don't know if you asked it or it was embedded, but the hardest part of this book journey is actually how do you play your own game?
Mm,
How do you stay on your own path when there are all these external metrics of success,
yeah.
expectations from other people, from yourself, and the added pressure of, what data point do I become for other people's decisions and how am I impacting other people's opportunities going forward? And that real life doesn't stop.
Yeah. Oh, for
Real
sure.
life doesn't stop while you're doing it. So that piece of your own journey, your own path, and that is going to look beautifully and uniquely different from anyone else's because no one else could live your life.
Yeah. And no one else except you has written your book.
It's true. It took me a really long time to get there
Mm,
of, yeah, there aren't that many people who could have written this book. And how do I use that for good? Right? All the dancing and the weaving that we talked about, that's my best attempt to date, and giving myself that license to say this is a point in time. I will continue to learn as everyone else continues to learn, and my hope with the book is that it catalyzes a conversation that helps us talk about silence, recognize it in our own lives, unlearn it, and really be able to live more fully.
Mm. Yeah. Well, thank you for modeling it and being one of those. I feel like it's so important every time a woman does own her voice is
Mm,
yet another example of it. So thank you for being that person. For
of course.
yeah. Well, let's go into our rapid fire questions if you were up for it. Yeah,
Let's do it.
they're always so fun. Okay, they're simple though. What was the last thing you watched on TV?
Alex versus America.
Oh, what is that about?
Alex Gornishelli, amazing, kick ass female chef, uh, battles other chefs who
Okay,
want to
cool.
win. It's a
Amazing.
reality cooking show.
That's awesome. So fun. I love it. What is on your nightstand?
Chapstick.
Chapstick.
I just took a cookbook off. The cookbook was made in Taiwan by Clarissa Wei.
I love that you read cookbooks before bed. Is that like your calming
You're
thing or
noticing a
just happen to
theme.
be there?
Apparently, I really like food, so that's my television and book consumption right now.
I know I used to be like an avid Top Chef watcher, and then I got
Mm.
rid of Bravo. So then I like don't, and now I just don't watch any cooking things. But I really, when I'm into it, like I'm also like I'm really into food also. So I'm always just like, let's think and talk about food all the time, unless I'm reading a book of something else. Yeah, I know. Is your family like that? Like while you're eating the current meal, you're talking about the next meal?
So this is the thing, my current family, meaning my husband and kid, do not share the same love
Oh,
of food. So it's a lot of texting with my best friend
okay. Just being like, let's talk about
who bought
this.
me the
The
cookbook.
cookbook. Okay. Okay. Amazing. Okay. When was the last time you tried something new and what was it?
Yesterday, I tried reusable water balloons. Um, and trying to impose some sort of shared understanding about the rules of water balloon fights with my son and his friends. I was unsuccessful in trying to institute common understanding about the rules, but it was a hot day and the water was refreshing.
Yes. Okay.
So maybe I also tried to reframe, which is not new. It is an ongoing journey.
Yes. I love that. That's so fun. So they're not supposed to explode them.
They're magnetic
Oh.
water balloons, which is actually fantastic. So you get less of the plastic waste and you just refill them and squish the water out and
Oh.
repeat.
Okay. But they didn't
But it was
necessarily
new
want
to
to do it
me.
that way. Yeah.
Yes, they want to throw them
Right. That's what I would think that
and
they
they
would
need a
want to
target.
do. Yes. That's what I figured for 6-year-olds. Okay, amazing. All right, last one. What are your top 3 most used emojis?
Ooh, the hand clap.
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm doing hand motions with this. The heart, facepalm.
Facepalm. Amazing. I love it. I
Mhm.
love hearing people. I mean, we all use all the emojis, but I love hearing the top ones because it
Yeah,
was pretty funny.
totally.
Yeah. Well, Elaine, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with you. We're going to link all of her stuff in there, her book and her website, just so you guys all can get to know Elaine better. And Elaine, just thank you so much for being on the School of Self Worth. I'm so grateful that you shared your wisdom and your time, both through your book and with us and our listeners today.
Honored. Thanks for having me.